Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome back to the show Joseph McBride, who is a film historian and professor in the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. His many books include How Did Lubitsch Do It?, as well as acclaimed biographies of Frank Capra, John Ford, and Steven Spielberg, and 3 books on Orson Welles, as well as many more. And today we're discussing Dancing on the Edge, his book on Billy Wilder. So, Joseph, welcome back. Thanks again for joining me again.
Great to be with you, Robert. It's always a pleasure because you're so well prepared and well versed in films. We always have a great discussion, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. And as we talked a little before starting, but I'll just say it again, how much I enjoyed the book and how enriching it is to have gone from his days in Germany as a reporter and journalist and a screenwriter in Germany to America and all the films that he directed and wrote and co-wrote and the various relationships with different writers. So I learned so much. I was already a big fan of his, but it's enriched my viewings of his films. So high compliments for sure.
I had a lot of fun writing this. I've been writing about him for more than 50 years. I wrote my first article on him in 1970 for Film Quarterly, which was a career overview that my collaborator Michael Wilmington wrote with me. He and I wrote a book on a critical study of John Ford, which was republished recently, and Mike died a couple of years ago. But from then on, I've been writing about Wilder and interviewing him over the years, and so he's a special favorite of mine. And one time I was talking to a woman at the Directors Guild, and I said, Billy Wilder is my idol. It just sort of popped out of my mouth, and she laughed, and she said, he's mine too. I'm too old to have an idol, but there you are.
Well, you discussed one thing you talked about in the book was why you decided to write this, because there are a number of books on Wilder and even books on individual films. But can you comment a little bit about the inspiration behind wanting to do this?
Yeah, there's some fine books. There are 2 good biographies. 3 actually. Ed Sickoff wrote a terrific one. Kevin Lally wrote a really good one, and there's a German biography about his European career by Hutter and Kamholtz. Also, Helmut Karasek wrote a biography with Wilder's cooperation. So his life has been covered rather well, and Maurice Zalato wrote a entertaining biography too. And but I think Wilder has been misunderstood, and that's really my motivation when I write a book. Usually is somebody is either misunderstood or underappreciated. Wilder is certainly appreciated a lot. I mean, most cinephiles love a few of his films, at least Some Like It Hot, The Apartment, and Sunset Boulevard. I mean, really some of the most popular films ever made. But he's misunderstood as people often think he's a cynic and misanthrope, or actually, and more precisely, they say he's a misogynist. Those are cliches that people throw around a lot. And I think they misunderstood him because I see him as a disappointed romantic. That's what I.A.L. Diamond called him. Diamond was his writing collaborator for half of his career, and Diamond correctly understood that Wilder's heart had been broken many times when he was young and had a kind of a rocky early youth, traveling around a lot with his parents. His father ran cafes, railroad cafes, so they would be on trains a lot. That's why you see a lot of trains and hotels in Billy Wilder movies. And his father also ran a hotel in Krakow, where Billy said he learned a lot about human nature, none of it favorable, at the hotel. Billiards and things with people, hung out with people there. And then he was Jewish in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism directed at him. And he went to Vienna. They moved to Vienna, and he said Vienna was even more anti-Semitic than Berlin, which is Austria. He said, don't forget that's where Hitler came from, you know, and so he experienced a lot of prejudice, and at school in Vienna, the kids called him a dirty Polak because where he was born was it's now part of Poland. It was kind of a backwater of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and but you know he was street wise, and he claimed he stole cars and got in trouble and was kind of a delinquent kid. And the first film he co-directed, is a French film called Mauvais Grain, which is very entertaining. He co-directed that with a French director, and it's about a kid from a respectable family who steals cars. He gets involved with a car ring, and it deals with that theme. You know, the guy's impatient with the kind of conventional life that his father wants him to lead, and he becomes a criminal. And it's kind of like Breathless. It's sort of a new wave-ish film shot on streets in Paris in 1933, and they didn't have a lot of money, so they had to shoot, you know, real locations, which is great. But so he was, and then he worked for newspapers, as you say, and I've been a newspaper guy since, well, a professional journalist since I was a kid. 1960, I sold my first article to a magazine, and I worked for newspapers and two regular newspapers in California and Wisconsin. Then I worked on Variety, Daily Variety in Hollywood. And so when I met Wilder, I got along with him right away because old newspaper guys talk the same lingo. We get along fine. I had the same kind of feeling when I met Sam Fuller. We just clicked immediately, you know. And when I met Wilder, you know, I say old newspaper guys, I was young, but when you're a newspaper guy, you're old just because you're, it's kind of, it wises you up very fast. Looking for a background picture I have one of when I met Wilder. I went on the set of the front page. I was working for a newspaper in Riverside, California, and there we are. And I went on the set and filmed the front page at Universal in 1974, which is based on the famous Ben Hecht and Charles MacArthur play about newspapers. And you know, I said to him, is this film going to reflect your experience as a newspaper guy in the 20s? And he said, no, because it would be very censorable even today, he said. He had a great line about his youth. He said he had a bad back throughout his lifetime, and he said he got it from screwing girls standing up in doorways. There were no girls, just doorways. I love that. Wonderful wit. He was a tremendous guy to interview because everything he said was quotable and funny. But as I said, people think, you know, he was this cynic who hated humanity and hated women, and it's just not true. I think he was. He's actually kind of a closeted romantic, and that's kind of the argument I make in my book, and we can talk that through his career.
Yeah, I was surprised to read that in the book that his detractors felt he was a cynic and a misogynist, because I never got that impression from watching his films. But for someone who has written about Wilder for so many years, what kind of things about his movies specifically appeal to you? Is there anything that sort of personally resonates with you, or what is it about his work?
Well, yeah, I have a sort of personal history in my own. He was kind of my sex education teacher to some extent. I grew up in a very repressed Catholic family, Catholic schools, and I was very sexually inhibited. And but I went to see Some Like It Hot at our local theater, even though it was what's the word, condemned by the Legion of Decency, you know, the Catholic organization. And
right.
It really knocked me out. It's such a funny film, but also Marilyn Monroe. I really had a tremendous hots for Marilyn Monroe. I remember when she was on the cover of Time magazine in 1956. Very interesting cover story on her. I had that magazine. I held on to it for years, and I studied it. she really appealed to me, and she's so sexy in that film, but also so vulnerable, you know, and she's so sweet and so adorable, and you know, kind of a troubled character like she was in life, and he brings that out on the screen, and you really love her. But that film, it kind of knocked me out as a 12-year-old kid. You can imagine it's about cross-dressing, like I probably didn't even know that such things happen. And so it kind of educated me on gender issues, gender as performance, as people talk about it now. It was way ahead of its time. And then this is funny, when he did Irma la Douce in 1963, which was his biggest commercial hit, with comedy about prostitution in Paris with Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine. And I went to see that, and I was so scandalized by it, still in Catholic school, that I walked out in the middle. I thought, this is too raunchy. And then I went back to see it again. I kept being drawn like a magnet. And then the second time I made it almost all the way through, but at the end of the movie, she's married, the former prostitute is married to Jack Lemmon, who's a policeman who becomes her pimp. And she's 9 months pregnant, and she starts going into labor on the altar, and I ran out of the theater. I was scandalized. Back a third time, and I made it all the way through, and that I think was a big step in my maturation process, that I actually got. And I didn't get to see Kiss Me Stupid, which he made the following year, which is a wonderful movie that was much.
Oh yeah, I love that one.
I'm glad you liked that. Yeah, it was
Yeah, I've seen it a few times. I watched it again toward the end of last year, and I was surprised. Surprised how unknown it is. You know, it's not very well known in his filmography, but it's such a wonderful, really, really wonderful and film. And I didn't realize the controversy around it, which you discussed. I did not know that at all. And if it was held off, 4 years or something, when the production code collapsed, I think maybe people would be talking about it more.
Yeah, it would have been seen as a fun. I mean, as Diamond said, we were kind of trying to make like a restoration comedy, and it's based on a play by Anna Bonacci, an Italian playwright, and the play is considered a classic in Europe. And whenever they do the play over there, it does very well. Jean Moreau starred in it in France. It was her first big success on the stage, and but it caused this big scandal in America. Let me read a thing that this really tells you something about Wilder, which I think is very telling. The film got pilloried. Well, I got the wrong book. I picked up a book on Albert Speer. Here's my Billy Wilder book. The only reviewer who gave it a good review in America was Joan Didion, the novelist, who was reviewing for Vogue magazine at the time. And she observed that Billy Wilder, quote, is not a funny man, but a moralist, a recorder of human venality. And she noted that audiences who saw the film on its initial release walk out, I suspect, because they sense that Wilder means it. The Wilder world is one seen at dawn through a world of cheap double entendre and stale smoke and drinks in which the ice is melted, the true country of despair. Kiss Me Stupid is in fact suffused with the despair of an America many of us prefer not to know. And after reading the review, Wilder wrote a note to Didion. I read your piece in the beauty parlor while sitting under the hairdryer, and it sure did the old pornographer's heart good. Cheers, Billy Wilder. What the movie is about is a couple of songwriters, small town songwriters in a town called Climax, Nevada, which is filmed in 29 Palms, California, which is a pretty bleak place. And Ray Walston and Cliff Osmond. And Dean Martin comes through town playing a comical version of himself. He's just wonderful. And they decide to try to sell him a song, but he indicates he needs to have a woman every day or he gets a terrible headache. So they bring the prostitute from the local bar, played by Kim Novak, to masquerade as the wife of the songwriter, and they have to maneuver the wife out of the house, and she's a very sweet woman, Felicia Farr. But it's very raunchy and very funny, and it's all about human venality, as Joan Didion pointed out, and it's bleak environment, very elegantly filmed, but it's really about the depths to which human beings will sink for greed and fame. You know, it's about show business.
Right.
Wilder really knew how people abase themselves for success in America. And as she wrote, the audience walks out because they sense that Wilder really means it. He's not kidding. And it takes place in a very recognizable American small town milieu, and he's making fun of the Puritanism and the small-mindedness of small towns where people all pry into each other's business and all this. And it's a very feminist film. One thing about Some Like It Hot, when my wife met Billy Wilder, she said, "I want to thank you for making a feminist film with Some Like It Hot." And he said, "Really?" And she said, "Yeah, it's a great feminist movie." And he said, "Oh, thanks." Well, what it is it's about men learning to walk in women's shoes, literally.
Yeah.
Learning what it's like to be a woman and get pinched and get, lectures coming on you and being treated like a piece of meat and everything. And Tony Curtis is a ladies' man, a cad who treats women badly. Jack Lemmon is the more innocent, naive, sort of sweet-natured guy who really loves being a woman too. He gets really off on dressing like women, which is fun.
Right.
Curtis, the arc of the story is the growth of Curtis's attitude toward women. By the end of the story, he's been manipulating Monroe all the way through to get her into bed, and he realizes that he's been treating her terribly, and he exposes his disguise, and that's what it's about. It's about learning to be a better man by being a woman for a while.
Yeah.
And that's Lubitsch's thing.
Yeah.
A disciple of Lubitsch. He had a famous sign on the wall of his office. How would Lubitsch do it? And Lubitsch, how did Lubitsch do it? And Lubitsch's theme, I realized after watching all his existing films, is how men should treat women and how women should treat men, and vice versa. And moralist above conventional morality. Lubitsch was very unconventional in his sexual attitudes and all, but he was very much about how people should treat each other, and Billy Wilder was too. And Irma la Douce is like that too, and so is Kiss Me Stupid. Kiss Me Stupid, the one character who's, well, the person who's the best person in the movie is the prostitute played by Kim Novak. She's a very fine, sweet, sensitive person with integrity, and Wilder loves her, and she's a marvelous.
Yeah. The women often tend to be very, very decent, I find, in his films. They're usually really like good people. Like they may, flaws like anybody else, but it's interesting, this reputation as being a misogynist. I can't help but wonder if that's maybe because the men are often so manipulative of women that maybe people think that, but I think maybe they're missing the point that the men learn from their mistakes. Is that sort of where that comes from?
That's a good insight, because people often confuse the characters with the film. I noticed,
right.
Like if you see a film which involves racism, like I showed to a class Frank Capra's Bitter Tea of General Yen, which is a great anti-racist film, really a wonderful movie. And a student criticized me for supposedly showing a racist film because some of the people in the film are racist. Well, you can't attack racism without showing racism.
Right.
You can't attack,
of course.
You can't attack misogyny without showing misogyny, and characters learning flaws. And but yeah, the women in his films, I went through. I have a lot in my book on many good women in his films, and Olivia de Havilland, she had a great performance in a film that Wilder wrote with Charles Brackett called Hold Back the Dawn, which is actually Wilder's most autobiographical.
Oh, yeah, that was one of the films I hadn't heard of before, and reading about it in your book, I went and watched it, and yeah, such a wonderful film. And then knowing more about how it's about his experiences to, as he was trying to get into America, just makes it all the more enriching and truthful to see what people have to go through in order to get a visa in desperate times. So I was glad you wrote about it, because I thought it was wonderful. It had certain things in common with Avanti, I found, as well.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm glad you saw that, and it's a hidden gem. Most people don't know. If the listeners are interested, there's a magazine called Bright Lights. It's an online film magazine, which unfortunately has kind of stopped publishing, but the website is still up there, and I published my chapter on Hold Back the Dawn there with some really interesting photographs.
I also check it out.
Billy Wilder's naturalization papers and things, and he was when he came to America, he was refugee, but he had a 6-month job at Columbia that a German producer who had come to America got him a job to write a script that didn't get filmed. But after 6 months, he had to leave the country and try to get a visa to come back. So he went to Mexicali, Mexico, which a lot of immigrants would do. And he stayed in a hotel with a lot of people waiting. And the film is about that. Charles Boyer plays the European gigolo who's stuck there and he's desperate to get into America. And he, a very sweet, sort of guileless school teacher played by Olivia de Havilland comes there on a field trip with some kids, and he decides to seduce her and marry her so he can get in the country, even though he doesn't care about her. He's a very heartless cat, but he learns to be a better human being because she's a terrific person. And what a performance! Wow.
Yeah.
The nomination for that. But she was, Olivia de Havilland was interviewed some years ago, and her most famous role is Melanie in Gone with the Wind, who's a very good person in most regards. And she said she finds it more interesting to play good women than bad women because, most actresses love to play bad women because it's colorful and everything. But she said people think that good women are not sexy. And she said, ha, ha, ha. Lady, but in a kind of a wholesome way and very intelligent. And so Wilder, he when he was stuck in that hotel, he finally got into America because when he got the Thalberg Award from the Academy in the 80s, he gave a speech and he focused on this consul. He was actually the assistant consul in the American consulate there. And this was the guy who held his future in his hands, whether he got And Wilder, he said to Wilder, "Do you have papers?" And Wilder said, "Not really, because I had to flee Nazi Germany, and if I went back, I'd be put in Dachau." And the guy was kind of walking around the office, kind of sizing him up, and he said, "Well, what do you do?" And he said, "I write movies." And the man sat down and stamped his application, and said, "Write some good ones."
I love that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story.
It's a great story.
Never wanted to disappoint that dear man in Mexicali, he said. And he said, I did. But after he said that on TV, somebody called him and said the man's name was Myers. And he was the assistant consul because the consul was on vacation. And I found the name of this fellow. His name was Willis Myers. And he was an amateur magician, so he was kind of a showbiz guy. That was his hobby, so maybe he had some fondness for him. So Wilder put these experiences into Hold Back the Dawn, even though it was directed by Mitchell Lyson, who was a very good director. But the reason Wilder became a director again after making one film in France as a director, he didn't enjoy the experience of directing.
Right.
But there was a scene in which Charles Boyer is lying on the bed in the hotel room, and he sees a cockroach climbing up the wall, and he starts talking to the cockroach about, how he identifies with the cockroach. And
it's too bad they didn't shoot that, because I think that would have been really interesting.
Yeah, you can find the script of that. And what happened was Wilder ran into Charles Boyer in a restaurant when they were shooting the film, and Boyer said they cut the scene with the cockroach because he said, "I don't talk to insects." And Brackett got so angry that they went back to the office and they thought, how do we get revenge on Boyer and Lyson? They decided, he said, if the son of a bitch won't talk to the cockroach, he won't talk to anybody. And they cut all his dialogue from the last part of the script. And he hardly says anything in the last part of the movie, which you would think might hurt the film, but it doesn't hurt that film in a way because he's a secretive deceiver, and he's guilty. And a lot of it is he's reacting to de Havilland and other people. But that's what made Wilder want to become a director again. And Wilder later made The Spirit of St. Louis, the film with Jimmy Stewart playing Lindbergh. And for about 30 minutes in the film, Lindbergh is talking to a fly that's buzzing.
In the plane, yeah.
And somebody said to Wilder, "Is this your kind of the return of the cockroach? You put a fly?" And he said, "Oh, I hadn't thought of that, but you're right." Mr. Stewart had no objection to talking to a fly. After all, he spent his career talking to agents. He says, into insects. But even that. Stewart said, "Can we get rid of the fly at a certain point?" And so they had the fly leave the airplane. But Wilder said the fly was a fellow aviator. There was kind of.
Well, that's one of the most interesting parts of that film, I find, is the talking of the fly, talking to the fly. But you mentioned his debut film, the one he did in France, and I was trying to find it, and I couldn't find it anywhere. And you also wrote about some of the films you wrote in Germany. And, a lot of them were assignments and things that he didn't like. But you talked about some of the more appealing ones. And again, I couldn't find any of them. You wouldn't happen to know, is there any attempt to try to get any of those on Blu-ray or a DVD?
I wish somebody would do that. That's a great idea. I've done a lot of commentaries on Wilder films for Kino Lorber has been putting Wilder films. And I've done, 10 or 11 commentaries, most recently Witness for the Prosecution for them. And the German films, there are these kind of websites where you can buy European films that are out of print, and I managed to find some of those. The one that I think is, one that is, two are available, I think. One is People on Sunday. It's a famous
that's an easy one to find. It's on the Criterion Channel.
1930 wonderful silent film, that a very super low budget film made without actors. They said, these were mostly non-professional people, and it was kind of like a pseudo documentary, very interesting kind of avant-garde film. And it had Robert Siodmak and Edgar G. Ulmer were the directors, and Eugen Schuftan was the cameraman, and Fred Zinnemann worked on it, and Wilder wrote it with Kurt Siodmak. All kinds of talent in that film.
Yeah.
Another one that is just wonderful is Emil and the Detectives that Wilder wrote in 1931. That's a famous book about children, a gang of children. It's a terrific movie, and that film has been remade several times. And I think that one is easy to find. You can find that one. And those were the two that Wilder thought were good. He wrote a lot of assignments in Germany. And this was the time when UFA was the big studio. He and other people like Robert Siodmak, because of People on Sunday, they got hired by the big studio UFA to make films, contract films. And it was a kind of a mixed bag because they were assigned to things sometimes that weren't very good. And UFA was partly controlled by a guy who was a big supporter of the Nazis. And so they were sort of disguised propaganda having people singing about how happy they were being poor, and kind of manipulating the public into thinking that they should just go along with whatever the economic system gave them. But so they're kind of uneven films. But there's one called A Blonde Dream, which I love. I think
that sounded good too. I wanted to see that one. I want to see that one.
You could find that Lillian Harvey, who was this marvelous, lovely singer, dancer, actress who is half German and half English, stars in the film, and she's in love with, she's kind of living with two guys. It's a love triangle, and there's some really beautiful music. Werner Hyman did the music, later came to America and did scores of Lubitsch films and other films. And his favorite song of all is this beautiful song she sings on a rooftop in Berlin overlooking some famous buildings. And she's singing about somewhere in the world there's a bit of happiness. It's a lovely song, and it's very poignant because it's 1932, right on the edge of the apocalypse in Germany. And they're living in an abandoned train car out in the country. And her dream is to come to Hollywood. That's an interesting aspect of the film. She wants to go to Hollywood because she's a circus performer at first. And she has this nightmare of going to Hollywood, which is fascinating in light of Wilder's anxiety about the future. He admitted that he said, like everybody in Europe, he wanted to go to Hollywood and make films, but he was anxious about it. Would he be good enough to succeed? And he had a hard time for the first few years, like most people do. But in the dream, she's pawed and mistreated by guys in Hollywood, just like today.
Right.
It's so modern, and it's a nightmare of what life is like in Hollywood. So she wakes up and says, "Gee, I'm not going to go to Hollywood. I'm going to stay at home." Unfortunately, then the enforced happy ending is, "I'm just going to be happy with my menial job and become a housewife," or whatever. That was kind of the Nazi
right.
the end of things. So that's one reason Wilder had a mixed view of some of these films. But he also did a good film called Scampolo, A Girl of the Streets, which is a really nice film starring Dolly Haas, who looks a lot like Audrey Hepburn, who Wilder directed in a couple of films later. And Scampolo is a marvelous film about a girl living by her wits on the streets. It's really kind of neorealist, it's like Italian neorealistic film. And so he did some interesting work. But one thing I wanted to do in this book, I always like to do this when I write about directors, is what did they do before they became famous? Because I love knowing how an artist develops.
Right.
In this case,
right.
Journalism was a big deal, and since I'm a journalist, I was fascinated by his journalism. And there are two books in German of his journalism. One is his Vienna reporting, and the other is the Berlin reporting. And when I was writing my Wilder book, they hadn't been published in English, but since then, Noah Eisenberg edited a collection of Wilder's journalism from both Vienna and Berlin, but it's selective. It doesn't include everything. But those two books, which I read in German, are really interesting. A lot of he covered all kinds of stuff, which is one of the good things about working for newspapers. You get all kinds of experiences and meet all kinds of different people. But there are some echoes or premonitions, I guess you'd say, of some of his later films. There's a very compassionate piece, for example, about an aging actress who's in ill health, famous stage star who's infirm, and it reminds you of Gloria Swanson and Sunset Boulevard. It has that kind of
Sunset Boulevard.
And he also loved an English dancing group called the Tiller Girls, and they were a sensation at the time. They were kind of syncopated dancers, very sexy dancers, and he just flipped over them. And he covered how they went from Vienna to Berlin by train, which is, you immediately think of Some Like It Hot, where the girls' band is traveling.
Oh, right.
He had this kind of tough woman who's in charge of them, and fending off guys and stuff. And Wilder, I mean, these articles he wrote in the Tiller Girls are very lecherous, but very funny. And he actually dated one of them in Berlin. He fell in love with one of the Tiller Girls, and so that has echoes in his later films. But the most remarkable thing he wrote, which would make a good movie, is a 4-part series called Waiter, Bring Me a Dancer, which came out in 1927 in a Berlin newspaper. He worked as a tea dancer. They called it Eintanzer, which is sort of like, taxi dancer, we would call it in America, where you get, he got tips. He would live off tips from the women. And this was at a couple of big hotels in Berlin. And you see these hotels in his films. One is the Adlon Hotel, which became the Grand Hotel that, MGM made that film Grand Hotel.
Right.
Adlon. And the Adlon was bombed in World War II and it was rebuilt, but there were references to it in Wilder's films. But anyway, he had to dance with all kinds of women, young, old, whatever. And he writes this series that's sort of sarcastic and mordant about how he had to have, spiffy clothes and shoes and how he had to do his hair up and cosmetics. And it's quite an interesting article by a scholar about the whole phenomenon of tea dancers in Berlin. And she talked about how dancers became sort of feminized because they had to focus so much on what women focus on, which is like cosmetics and appearance. And,
right.
And the hypocrisy Wilder writes about having to kind of be romantic with women he didn't find appealing, and all that. So it's kind of professional. It's like being a gigolo, except he makes clear in there he didn't have sex with any of them, but who knows. At the end of the series, a woman takes him home with her, but she's very condescending to him, and he's treated like an automaton, a piece of meat. So he really understands what women go through, and this woman is hardly interested in him as a human being and wants to take him inside. And she makes a reference to Immanuel Kant, and like she thinks that he's stupid. And he knew very well who Immanuel Kant was, but he pretended not to. And so she kind of smiled condescendingly. It ends with him walking away. It would make a terrific movie. It's kind of like Cabaret,
Yeah, it sounds appealing. Yeah.
I talked to Wilder about that, and it's interesting. He gave different versions over the years. Why was he doing this? Some people think he was working as a tea dancer, and then he decided to write it up. And other people think he got the job so he could write it up because he was a freelance writer, had to come up with ideas, and was a very competitive. And he was. It turns out, when you study it, he actually was working as a tea dancer for a while because he was broke. There was a period where he had to sleep on park benches and things. And some friends of his who were dancers got him this job. And so in his films, there are many gigolos or project workers, kept men and kept women. Joe Gillis in Sunset Boulevard, played by William Holden, is a classic example of the kept man of this rich older woman. And so that series really inspires a lot of Wilder's films about sex workers and the relations between the sexes in general.
Well, we touched a little on People on Sunday, which is one of the films he did in Germany that he was a co-writer on. And I thought it was interesting that, he and Zinnemann and Siodmak and Ed Ulmer, they all went on to make some of the greatest film noir movies, but yet it's interesting that was like an answer to German Expressionism at the time that was very popular, and that this is, almost like a neorealist kind of film. And I wonder if is it known when did he later sort of embrace that style, because he certainly utilized it in his Double Indemnity for example, but it seems as if there was a style it didn't appeal to him that later he certainly used. So I was curious if you knew his general feelings on German Expressionism.
Yeah, I go into that a lot because he fits into German film. German films were the leading world cinema films in the 20s. They had Fritz Lang and Murnau and a lot of filmmakers, and Hollywood imported both Lang and Murnau and Lubitsch also. Three of the greatest directors ever. And German Expressionism was a fantastic movement. It was not just cinema, but it was also in literature and theater and painting. And, it's about,
right.
Expressionism is to make visible what's inside people. In other words, the world reflects.
Yes.
It became very popular after the disillusionment of World War One. The classic is Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, where it's about a madman and the whole world is distorted. The sets are distorted and everything. And that influenced film noir. It leads directly to film noir. And as you say, one of the guys came over, like Robert Siodmak, made some very important noir films.
Absolutely.
Detour and things like that.
Yeah.
Wilder's Double Indemnity is considered one of the leading film noir classics. But after a while, as things go, German Expressionism, people were getting a little tired of it, and they got into a thing called the New Objectivity, which was kind of more sort of documentary-like and dealing with life on the streets and life, how people actually lived. And so People on Sunday is in that vein, but it is very much a precursor to what after World War II the Italians were doing. And
yeah,
he liked to make fun of neorealism. He would kid about it, but some of his post-war films, Foreign Affair, which is a fantastic film.
Oh, yeah.
Ruins of Berlin. That's a relatively unknown Billy Wilder film.
Yeah. Another great one. More people should see.
It is. Who else but Billy Wilder would make a romantic comedy set in the ruins of Berlin?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's very. It's a dark film, but very funny and very romantic too. And it's got my favorite actress, Jean Arthur, and John Lund is terrific as the guy, and Dietrich is in it, and. But he also made Ace in the Hole, which is one of his greatest films, which is
a
notorious flop because it's such an indictment of the public. He made that in 1951, and that's kind of like a documentary-like film. It's shot on real location in New Mexico, this mountain where a guy is trapped in a cave, and an unscrupulous reporter played by Kirk Douglas keeps him trapped so he can exploit the story for his own benefit. And then, unfortunately, the guy can't be rescued after a while. Douglas, it's a really dark story. Douglas.
Yeah.
And then he has a certain amount of guilt, and he allows himself to be killed. And it's a tremendous film. And
it's fantastic.
Wilder once said, he said, people didn't like that film, but fuck it, it's my best movie. He said,
Well, even I was shocked when I saw A Foreign Affair, because particularly in that period after the war, films that dealt with the war often were sort of black and white. The Nazis were the pure villains, and everyone else were the heroes, and they didn't show the ways in which people compromised to survive, and we see that with Dietrich. And I thought, wow, to think that he did that just a few years after it ended, to show like that he was empathetic towards her. And I was really surprised in a major Hollywood film, but that's how it shows how audacious he was. It's quite something.
Groundbreaker, as you say. And that film caused controversy. It was denounced in Congress, and Paramount seemed to back off from the film and kind of stopped releasing it after a while. And it got some vicious reviews. People often attack Wilder because he's so honest, and one reason you asked why I'm so interested in Wilder, my whole life is basically an attempt to kind of penetrate beyond the lies and myths that were fed and see the truth, and that's why I my whole life. My parents were newspaper reporters who were honest reporters, but the media lied to us so often. I wrote a book on how the media lie about the Kennedy assassination, political truth, the media and the assassination of President Kennedy, and that's been a lifelong study of mine. I worked for Kennedy as a volunteer in 1960 in his presidential primary campaign, and when he was killed, I was very disillusioned because I want to solve the crime, and I was going to go into politics, and I went to writing instead. But I felt that I was lied to systematically and brainwashed really by the Catholic Church and our political system and our school system. And it was really hard to break out of that until I was like 18 or 19. It was a real struggle. And so to me, it's been a lifelong process of trying to dig into the truth. So when I write a book, I go beyond the cliches or the lies or like Frank Capra, when I did my biography of him, Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success. I like his films. I still like his films a lot, but he was a fraud. His autobiography is a pack of lies, and he created a myth about himself with the complicity of the media. And I realized that after a while, and I started digging into it, and I wrote a book that corrected the myth, and it caused a lot of controversy. A lot of people liked it, but some people got very angry because they don't like their myths shaken, And then John Ford, great filmmaker, but mysterious guy, deliberately. He kind of kept people in the dark about what he really felt. You have to look at his films to understand what he really felt, because he would lie to the press all the time about everything. He never gave a straight answer. And so I really felt that I wanted to figure out, who is this guy who made these great films, and how did they come out of this rough facade? And, that's my motive in writing any book. And so Wilder appealed to me because he's that kind of guy. His films are exposés, it's like that. Former newspaper guy, he makes films that are exposés of social issues and social problems, and
absolutely,
both of them are fantastic filmmakers. And so Wilder, Ford was asked by an interviewer in the 30s, and the guy said, "Do you believe in making films about things that make you angry?" And Ford said, "What the hell else does a man live for?" Kind of how I am, and I like filmmakers who are like that. So Billy Wilder was angry about the way the press lied and manipulated stories, so he makes Ace in the Hole, and he was angry about how Hollywood treats people. He makes Sunset Boulevard. He's angry. Like you say, Foreign Affair, it is remarkable. Here's a guy who lost his mother, stepfather, and grandmother to the Holocaust. The Nazis killed them. And he goes back to Germany and makes this film, and yet Dietrich's character, who's a Nazi sympathizer in the film, she, after the war, out of expediency, she becomes the mistress of an American intelligence officer, which would get the guy in trouble if that became known. But she's just somebody who's trying to survive, and Wilder admires her skills in survival, and she's kind of a good person.
Yeah.
But the thing about Wilder's characters, and this applies to women too, and answers your question, why do people think he's a misogynist? Well, he's honest about human beings, whether they're male or female. He has a lot of women in his films who are terrific people, like, say, Shirley MacLaine in The Apartment, who is sexually exploited by her boss, but she's complicit in that too. And she's got flaws, but she's basically a really lovable, decent person. But she's there's a famous ending of something like that. Nobody's perfect, But he doesn't sentimentalize women.
I'll start talking about Nancy Olson.
Nancy, yeah. Go. I actually interviewed her when her memoir came out.
You did, huh? Lucky guy. I wish I had a chance to do that.
Yeah, she was as sharp as a wit for I believe she's 94 or 95. And after we went, hopefully Nancy won't mind me saying this, but when we went off the air, she said to me, I have to ask you, how do I look?
Gorgeous. She's a gorgeous woman.
Yeah. I thought, is it because apparently she had it in the book, she talked about some insecurities around her looks and stuff. So I thought, well, I wonder if that's why she was asking me. But and then I think I said, oh, you would look, I think I said 95, I thought she was, or maybe I got her age wrong. I said, oh, well, for mid 90s, you look amazing. And I think I said 95 and she said 93 or something like that. But
I met Nancy Olson when I was working on one of the AFI Life Achievement Award shows. She was kind of a helper to the AFI, and I just had a chance to say to her, I said, I've dated several women because they remind me of the character you played in Sunset Boulevard.
Right.
She's a scriptwriter. And some of the women I liked best in Hollywood were readers. It's an occupation that actually has a lot of power. They hire these intelligent, they're usually young women in their late 20s, well-educated, and they get to say thumbs up or thumbs down on projects. And they have tremendous power because producers and other people don't like to read, So, but anyway, when I told Nancy Olson I dated several women because they remind me of your character, she said, "Oh, I'm very sorry to hear that." And
I heard that story.
For decades, I worried about that. I should have looked her up again, and I didn't know what she meant by that. And I told this to a friend of mine who's another podcaster, and I said, when you interview her, maybe you could ask her what she meant by that, and he did. And she said to him, well, my character is an opportunist, she felt. And I didn't see her character, Betty Schaefer, as an opportunist in Sunset Boulevard, even though I guess what she means is everybody who works in Hollywood is kind of an opportunist, and she's a reader who wants to be a screenwriter. So she hooks on to Joe Gillis, who's a struggling screenwriter who's become this kept man, and they're writing a script together. But
I guess she felt she was maybe Betty was using him to an extent. I guess you could look at it that way, but there is certainly feelings. She certainly has feelings for him at the same time. I guess it's a little more layered.
She's the positive force in that movie, and toward the end of the movie, he brings her to his mansion where he's living to show her the truth. And she says, "I can't see any of this. Let's go. Let's get out of here. I don't care." And you want to scream at the guy to go with her. She's so terrific. He could have a great life with her, and he won't do it because he thinks he will drag her down, and then he gets killed.
Right.
But she is such a positive force in that film. She kind of shows that you can be working in Hollywood and still have integrity and honesty and sincerity. And this is an interesting tale about Wilder. When I was back in Wisconsin, where I came from, I became very fond of Wilder's films, and I loved Sunset Boulevard. But I thought Sunset Boulevard was maybe a little too negative toward Hollywood. I kind of had a romantic view of Hollywood, and I also thought Betty was maybe a little too good to be true. But then I go out to Hollywood and I find out there are women like Betty, like I said, and the film is like a documentary. When I met Wilder, I said, Sunset Boulevard is it's like a documentary about Hollywood. And he said, he said it's a Valentine, is what he said. It's a Valentine. In other words, he's implying that he kind of cleaned it up a bit. But at the time, some people like Louis B. Mayer, he often told the story that Louis B. Mayer, after a screening, threatened to have him deported for making Sunset Boulevard.
Right.
And Wilder said, "Fuck you, Mr. Mayer," which took a lot of guts for somebody to say that to one of the most powerful people in Hollywood. But actually, deportation would be one of the greatest anxieties for a guy like Wilder, who was in exile.
Right.
He was in exile, and I write about this a lot in my Wilder book, that he was in exile 5 times over. First born in what is now Poland, then they moved to Vienna, then he goes to Berlin, then he has to flee and he goes to Paris, then he comes to America. And then the final exile, in a sense, was his internal exile, as I call it, that he wasn't allowed to make a film for the last 22 years of his life in Hollywood, which I thought was outrageous and scandalous. And I mentioned that when I gave Wilder our Career Achievement Award from the LA Film Critics. So I was in the commissary at Universal talking to a producer I knew, and, you know, she was trying to tell me about a project she wanted me to do. And she said there was a romantic comedy she wanted to make, but she couldn't figure out who to get to direct it, because who in Hollywood was making romantic comedies in the 80s, you know? And I said, well, Billy Wilder. Get Billy Wilder. And she looked at me like I was crazy, and she said, Billy Wilder, he's not bankable. And I thought, this is outrageous. I mean, here's a guy, one of the greatest filmmakers ever, and he's you know, I mean, he made his front page for Universal, and then he was going to do Fedora for Universal, and they passed on it. So he had to get tax shelter money from Germany. He had to go back to Germany to make that film. Right. But he was he just couldn't get a job in Hollywood. I mean, but anyway, the women in Wilder's films are often kind of the moral center of the films. Kim Novak in Kiss Me Stupid, for example. But they're flawed just like everybody. And I think that, see, Hollywood back in those days, women were either virgins or whores. I mean, this is a broad, overly broad statement, because there were a lot of fascinating female characters in the history of Hollywood, obviously. But there was a tendency to try to put them in these categories of bad girl or good girl, you know, and to eliminate some of the complexities, the gray areas of life. But Wilder didn't do that. He just treated everybody as real people, and he had a great understanding of human nature and psychology. And so he didn't sentimentalize women like a lot of women were put on pedestals and sentimentalized back in Hollywood. And if you didn't do that, people would think you're a misogynist to some extent. But I think people have gotten over that. And Molly Haskell, who is a terrific critic, who wrote what I think is one of the best books on Hollywood, called From Reverence to Rape, the treatment of women in the movies. She gave a quote from my Wilder book saying that Wilder's view of women holds up really well today because he doesn't sentimentalize women. Yeah. She appreciates that.
Well, one of the other films that has a great female lead is in Avanti, which I know is a favorite of yours. Yeah. It's interesting because when I first saw it, I liked it. I didn't love it. And then when I read your insights about it, I'm like, well, that sounds more interesting than I remember. And then when I saw it again, I liked it a lot more, particularly the element of the two of them becoming like their parents. Mm-hmm. I mean, that scene down to literally when they have to identify the bodies and the guys say, and they have to put their hand up and say, I do. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. But one of the, it's interesting because the character is so I forget her name now, the female lead.
Pamela Piggott.
Pamela Piggott, who thinks she's overweight, but clearly isn't. And I know that they wanted her to be bigger, which I couldn't help but wonder. I know that you mentioned people criticized it for that. Like, she says she's big, but she's not big. And Lemon's character seems to think that she's also big. And I can understand on the one level that she could just maybe think that she's big, because I've met women who are thin, but because of the media making everyone feel that women have to be razor thin, they just think that they're big. But because he's also saying she's big, at times calls her a fat pig and stuff. Do you think it would have worked better if she was able to? I know she couldn't put on the weight that they wanted.
Well, she put on Juliette Mills is wonderful in the role, and she's great. She put on something like 20 or 25 pounds. I think he wanted her to put on like 35 pounds, but she's gorgeous. She's Zoftig.
Yeah. She was
shapely. And Billy Wilder was a great connoisseur of art. And there's a French documentary on Wilder talking about his art collection. And one of the artists he loved was Botero, who was known for doing voluptuous women with large, rounded derrieres, for example. And he said, I'd love to look at a Botero with a large derriere every day when I get up there. So he had an appreciation for the Zoftig form. And he was not into the razor thin thing. Although, I mean, he directed Audrey Hepburn, who was sort of created that razor thin beauty. But I mean, she came by it naturally because she was living in World War II in Netherlands, and she was part of the resistance, and et cetera. But in the movie Avanti, which I actually, it's kind of my favorite Wilder film. I just love it. Jack Lemmon plays a guy who's a sexist character, and he likes to have meaningless affairs with stewardesses and waitresses, etc. But he meets this woman who's very romantic, a younger woman, at this resort because their parents have both died in a car accident. And they find out that their parents were carrying on a long time relationship, which scandalizes Lemmon because he's a satirical version of American businessman, what they used to call the ugly American character. And Wilder has a number of them in his work. Americans who are crass, materialistic people who go to Europe and understand the finer things in life. And so it's about his education as a human being and becoming a mensch. In The Apartment, they verbalize that because there's this Jewish doctor who lives next door to Jack Lemmon's character, and he lectures him on, you got to be a mensch, and that's what the film is about. And so Lemmon in Avanti makes some very nasty remarks about her weight, but you look at her, she's gorgeous. It's like a few years ago, I started reading comments that people said Marilyn Monroe was fat. And I thought, what? Marilyn Monroe? I've always worshipped Marilyn Monroe as my romantic ideal of women.
Yes.
And, but shows
how much we've regressed in society.
By today's standards, if Marilyn Monroe is not considered attractive, what's wrong with us?
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, she's shapely in the two Wilder films she did, but so anyway, Pamela is gorgeous, and they wind up having a sexual relationship, and they have this nude swimming scene, which is really hilarious. It's it's one of the first extended nude scenes in Wilder, and it's a very romantic film. It's Wilder tried to do Lubitsch films throughout his career. I mentioned Lubitsch was his mentor, and Wilder's career, when he came to Hollywood, he struggled for a while because the only jobs he could get were to do sort of Europeanized Hollywood films, kind of operetta type films. And he was stereotyped as that because he was Austrian. And but then he got teamed with Charles Brackett by a smart story editor at Paramount named Manny Wolfe. And he and Brackett wrote Lubitsch's Bluebeard's Eighth Wife, which is not a good film, frankly. It's a kind of a screwball comedy that's kind of unpleasant, but it led to NINOTCHKA, which is a great film.
That's so good. Yeah,
they wrote that with Walter Reich, and Walter Reich was an old friend of Wilder's from Germany, who he had worked with in Germany. And it's one of the great romantic comedies. It's a political satire as well. And so Wilder was always trying to do Lubitsch films on his own, and they never quite worked. And he admitted that, it was like Lubitsch, but not Lubitsch. Lubitsch had some special quality you could not really copy. And my book on Lubitsch, How Did Lubitsch Do It? The last chapter is what happened to us, as Peter Bogdanovich said. Why don't we have these romantic films, humane romantic comedies anymore? Romantic comedies have often become very ugly and crass.
Yeah.
And I went through. There have been some that are truly good, but you have to kind of adapt it for the changing times in the modern world. And one film I think that does that is Avanti, and Wilder's earlier attempts, such as Love in the Afternoon and a couple of other ones, were awkward for various reasons. But Avanti, I think, is a very Lubitchian film, and part of it is what you mentioned: these two people reenact the love affair of their elderly parents. So it's a different generation, and it's a more romantic generation, and going through the rituals. They order the same food, they wear the same clothes, they have the Italian band playing on the terrace with the same music. And so it's kind of like they're paying tribute to the past, while it's still a very contemporary film in terms of sexual liberation. And it's a very sharp satirical film, and it's also very beautiful to look at. It was filmed on the island of Ischia. It's a lot of terrific exteriors, and it's a very lovely film. It's interesting. I have some friends here in Berkeley who are, one of them is a retired Berkeley professor, and another one is a couple of other retired professors at different schools. And I showed them Avanti. They hadn't seen this film a couple of years ago, and they were horrified by Avanti.
Really?
And I thought, what? And they said it was anti-Italian because he has a lot of fun with the Italian characters.
Oh, right. Okay.
And it's a lot about the cultural clash between American values and Italian values, but the Italian values are the ones that he likes, the kind of more relaxed view of life, the more sensual, less puritanical version. But he makes fun of the bureaucracy and stuff. And it was a wonderful performance by Clive Revel as an Italian hotelier. He's
hilarious.
Wonderful.
One of my favorite lines is when they're talking about the coroner, and then when he's late, everyone takes these 3-hour lunch breaks, and I laughed for a good 5 minutes when when Lemon says, "Oh, he's not here because he's on lunch like everybody else," and he says something like, the coroner always eats well because he knows all the widows. I was that was brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, Wilder he satirizes whatever milieu he's dealing with, and so he's having fun with the kind of dilatory, more relaxed European lifestyle. And at the time when Avanti came out, people thought it was too slow, too long, and I wouldn't lose a minute of it. It is wonderful, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
Because the pacing is part of the point. It's live a relaxed, sensual life. Yeah. And also the delays of bureaucracy are part of the story because they give time for Lemon to adapt and have a romance with Juliet Mills. And anyway, I was trying to, enlighten my friends on it's not attacking Italian people, it's having fun with cultural differences. And
I didn't think that at all. I mean, I could see why people would think that, like, the guys who try to they steal the corpses to get money from him, but I didn't. I mean, because my family's Italian, and I've seen some really horrendous portrayals, down to like sausages around the neck. I've seen some really bad stereotypical stuff, but no, that I didn't feel that at all. I just thought, I mean, he's being satirical, but he's doing that with the American characters just as much, like Lemon, who is this money obsessed guy who doesn't, because he's corrupted by greed and money, and he doesn't believe in love anymore. And then of course, these Europeans make him see that love still exists. I particularly appreciated when you mentioned in the book when she mentions to Lemon that her mother never took any money from him, and you see Lemon is so shocked, like, oh, that there's no money involved. This is just real love. And that didn't dawn on me because, it's just all in his reactions. I thought that's a really good, that was a really good insight, I thought. So yeah. People should light it up.
Because I mean, he's a wealthy guy, runs a big factory with his father, and she's the mother was a manicurist at a London hotel who lived very modestly, and but she didn't take money. And as you say, Lemon is stunned, and she says, well, she loved him, but that kind of is a contrast with so many relationships in Wilder's films where it is mercenary, and that kind of corrupts and pollutes the relationship. He gets into the people have a lot of problems with relationships in life because of money and other social problems. And in this case, that's one of the things that he discovers is delightful about the mother and the daughter, who's also lives modestly. And but then the capper of the evening was my friend, who's a retired Berkeley professor, said, "Well, the film is anti-American too." And I thought, wait a minute, you're a Berkeley professor, you're complaining a movie is anti-American? What but it satirizes the American, as you say, the materialism and the kind of colonialist attitude toward Europe. He's very condescending toward Europeans at first. He has to be
arrogant too. Be like on the plane, just thinking he could do whatever he wants, and when he goes through with his passport, how dare he be questioned? And just the ego Lemon did it so well too. I mean, that's it's funny because I know you feel that he's one of the best. He's the best actor of his generation, and I've come to agree with that in a lot of ways because as an actor myself, I was always very inspired, and I still am, by Clift and Brando and the great people from this actor studio. And they're incredible. But Lemon he could just do not only drama but comedy so effortlessly, and not a lot of actors. You can't say that about a lot of actors. So he's phenomenal in that film as well.
Yeah, he's underrated in that sense.
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
He has such a fabulous career when you look over his range as an actor. And, I'm still kind of discovering some Lemon films I haven't seen before. And I worked with him a couple times on one of the AFI shows, and I interviewed him about John Ford. And he was a wonderful guy to interview. He's a super smart fellow, Harvard graduate, and he started with George Cukor. His first film was It Should Happen to You.
I've been meaning to see that. I haven't seen it, but it looks really interesting. I've been meaning to check that out.
Yeah, Judy Holliday and Jack Lemmon.
Yeah.
Lemmon had done many TV shows and theater things. And he said that he was used to projecting to the second balcony, and Cukor kept saying, less, less, less. And Lemmon started getting kind of cranky, and he said, I usually don't get cranky with directors, but I was getting kind of exasperated, and he turned to Cukor and said, "Are you telling me I shouldn't act at all?" And Cukor said, "Oh yes, please, dear boy, please, please, please." And he said that was the best lesson he had as an actor. A screen actor, it's more about being than projecting as a screen actor. It's what you are. Hopefully you're an interesting person, you have technique, but you don't have to project and indicate things. And I wrote about Lemon's performance in that film in my upcoming book, George Cukor's People, Acting for a Master Director, because I think Cukor, again, is the kind of director, he's been underrated because he worked through his actors and he had fidelity to the text, was very important to him. He didn't believe in improvising, etc. But he still put his stamp on films because he picked projects that were compatible with them, and he worked wonderfully with actors and brought out all kinds of depths. And so I've written essays on about 60 of the performances in Cukor's films. It's coming out this December. And so I've become very fascinated studying acting in cinema. Wilder's two favorite actors were Jack Lemmon and William Holden, and he loved both of them equally. And Cameron Crowe did an interview book with Wilder, and he said, "Who do you relate to the most of all your characters?" And he said, William Holden's character is Sefton in Stalag 17, who's this hard-boiled GI POW in a German prison camp who's cynical and but he's a very intelligent man. Truffaut, Francois Truffaut, when he was a young critic, wrote a review of Stalag 17. He loved the film. He said it's the story of an intelligent man surrounded by idiots, and that's why he liked the film. It's the dilemma of the intelligent man, and it's also kind of covertly about the Hollywood blacklist, because during that period you couldn't deal directly with the blacklist on screen, but a lot of Hollywood films in the 50s were about informing and betrayal. And that film there's an informer inside the barracks who is causing all kinds of havoc, and the soldiers are trying to figure out who it is, and they unfairly blame Holden. But Wilder loved Holden from Sunset Boulevard, who is Holden's character, Joe Gillis, is kind of the hero of all screenwriters. We all adore him because he's a struggling guy he says wonderful things. He gets to narrate the film, which is wonderful, even though he's dead, which was unusual. But American Beauty did the same thing later, but Billy Wilder was ahead of the time. But I think it's kind of a kind gesture by Wilder to let the screenwriter rewrite the story of his life after he's dead, And so Holden makes these remarks about Hollywood. For example, he says he wrote a movie that was about Okies in the Dust Bowl, but you wouldn't know it when it reached the screen. It took place on a submarine, that kind of thing. And we can all relate to those kind of stories. And but he's a struggling screenwriter. He gets becomes a gigolo, and then he gets shot. And then Holden later in life did Fedora for Wilder, which is one of Wilder's last films and his last really important film, and a mixed bag because it has some flaws, but it is a fascinating film partly because of the flaws. And it's another story about Hollywood. He plays a producer, and I interviewed Wilder a number of times. I did a 2-day interview with Todd McCarthy with Wilder in the 70s at the time after he had done Fedora, when it was in limbo before it came out. And Wilder said, I could do 3 movies about that guy who's dragging his ass along Hollywood Boulevard, that producer is struggling to make a movie, and he's desperate to make a movie, and he gives a fine performance. And Lemon was sort of the everyman character in Wilder's films, and Wilder worked with him first in Some Like It Hot, and they did The Apartment and the other films. Fortune Cookie,
Avanti. Irma La Douce, so many.
Irma La Douce, he was kind of Wilder's alter ego in a sense too. So those are 2 sides of Wilder. Those 2 terrific stars. They're both great actors and great stars.
Well, speaking of Fedora, I know you felt one of the flaws was Martha Keller. Mm-hmm. And I it's funny because I when I first saw it, I actually thought she was good, and then when I read what you wrote, I could see what you're saying, because she seemed to be moving her head a little bit. She didn't always, her hands are, she didn't always often know what to do with her hands. But I thought, in a way, it's sort of, she had a hard time on the set, with Wilder and stuff, which you wrote about. But in a way, it sort of worked because the character is so anxious and being controlled and is sort of losing her mind. Perhaps in some of the scenes where she's meant, in the flashbacks with the affair she's having with the Holden character when he's younger, because she maybe didn't have that sense of grand movie stardom. Maybe someone like Faye Dunaway, like you mentioned, could have been stronger. If very much like the Gloria Swanson or character. I thought I could see what you're saying, but I don't know. I thought I did think she was pretty good, but you felt that in a way she was compelling, even though.
Well, I reached the same conclusion that even though she's actually kind of inept in the film, it does sort of fit the film, because she is this woman she's not an actress, and she's made to impersonate her mother. Right. It's a complicated plot. And so a lot of Wilder's films deal with impersonation and masquerading. Yeah. And I wondered for a long time, why does he have so many masquerades in his films? I realized it's because he's in exile. Exiles have to masquerade, in a sense, to fit into a new society, whether they want to or not. They have to adapt to the clothing and the language and the lifestyle and everything. And so Wilder's fascinated by that theme, and the duality of people, and people being not what you think they are. But she plays a desperate character who's inadequate to the role she's been put into. And so Mark Keller's flailing around and desperate line readings and actions, I think kind of fit the character in a sort of odd way, in a poignant way. Wilder considered Faye Dunaway. He also, Universal, when they were going to do the film, they said, why don't you cast Katharine Hepburn as the mother and Audrey Hepburn as the daughter? And that would have been interesting. I wish he had done that. I mean,
I think that would have worked.
They almost have a certain kind of affinity, even though they don't quite look alike, but they're both kind of angular and thin and,
have that upper class kind of feel as well about them, the way they talk and affluent personalities.
So I thought, geez, Wilder made a big mistake in casting, and he saw her in Bobby Deerfield, and I hadn't seen that at the time, but I went to look at it, and wow, is she terrible in Bobby Deerfield? She's just awful.
Yeah, I have to see that again. I'm a big Pacino fan. I know that's one of his flops, one of the ones he didn't do very well.
Very strange film. But he realized after a few days that he had made a big mistake in casting, and he just kind of soldiered on with the film. But then they had to, I did a Q&A with Wilder at the LA County Museum after Fedora came out. And as we were about to walk down from the back, he leaned over and whispered to me, he said, make sure your fly is zipped up. He said, John Barrymore told me once, that's the last thing you do before you go on the stage is check your fly.
Oh,
I didn't.
Good tip.
I was going to put that in the book. I didn't put that. I couldn't find a place for that, but I give you that tip. But anyway, when we were doing the Q&A, I brought up to Wilder. I said, you had another actress dubbing a lot of the film, and in fact, this German actress dubbed both Mark Keller and Hildegard Neff, who plays her mother, and Wilder got all anxious and said, oh, let's not talk about that. And I said, oh, okay. So we'll move on. But Rex McGee, who was a screenwriter friend of mine, who was a protege of Billy Wilder's for years and got to be very close with Wilder, worked on Fedora, and he preserved copies of the film, including one with the original soundtrack. And he let me listen to the original soundtrack of the film before it was dubbed. And you could tell that Mark Keller really had trouble with her line readings. She didn't seem to understand some of the dialogue. I mean, she wasn't, English was not her first language, too. She was Swiss.
Right.
And she had trouble with certain lines that were complicated. But Hildegard Neff was a fine actress, and she gave a marvelous performance, you could tell. And then the person who dubbed both of them was not as good as Hildegard Neff's original performance. And Neff was very unhappy. She said, first he took away my face because she has this kind of weird mask of scars and old age. And then now he takes away my voice. But it kind of adds to the weirdness of this film. And Wilder said to me, I realized certain films can't be cast. He said it worked as a novella by Tom Tryon, the former actor who wrote this novella that's good. But he said, it doesn't, not everything can be made into a film. And
I can see that.
It all starts, Wilder once said, a film is a hit or a flop. It's decided in the first 7 seconds when you get the idea. He said, you get an idea for a movie, and then it's decided, is this film going to be a hit or a flop, and there's, you can do all kinds of stuff, but there's nothing you can do to, rescue something that isn't meant to be a good film, But Fedora is expressive in many ways, and it's Wilder and Diamond's comment on the modern film industry. And I interviewed Paul Diamond, who's I.A.L. Diamond's son, and Paul's a screenwriter too, and he gave me some very good insights into that relationship. Wilder always wanted to have a writing partner. There are only three scripts in his entire career that he gets sole credit on. He worked with collaborators in Germany and then Charles Brackett for a long time in America, and then they split. And then he worked with various writers in the 50s until he found Diamond. And Diamond and he were very simpatico. But he said that Paul told me that Fedora was his dad and Wilder's very dark, bitter comment on the new Hollywood and how they were put to pasture, older filmmakers were shunted aside. And Wilder told me with great wit, I couldn't do films like Saturday Night Fever, which I enjoyed, but couldn't do Grease 2. And, he said Dr. Pepper's Band or whatever he called it,
All right.
He had a lot of sarcastic comments about the modern Hollywood. And Diamond had a great comment in an AFI seminar. He said, you go to a current movie, and he said, under the titles, zebras are fucking women. What are you going to do to top that? But actually, that's this serious point, that one of the things that happened to Wilder is he was an iconoclastic filmmaker who broke a lot of taboos. We were talking about making movies about very difficult subjects and kind of pushing the envelope of censorship. And The Apartment was considered sort of scandalous and risque in 1960, and Irma La Douce. And then his career never recovered from Kiss Me Stupid being seen as a horrible scandal, even though it's a great movie about American sexual hypocrisy. But what he did was, when the film industry started being more open to sexuality and language in the late 60s, when the code was abandoned and they brought in the rating system, which was theoretically more lenient, but has its problems too. But Wilder, instead of going all out and making movies like, say, Midnight Cowboy, he became more romantic and kind of old-fashioned deliberately. He made The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which I think is one of his greatest movies. And I loved that film when it came out in 1970. I wrote a review of that for Film Quarterly with Mike Wilmington. But that film flopped. It was this very romantic look at Sherlock Holmes. And it's kind of a bittersweet debunking of Sherlock Holmes. It's about this brilliant man who tries to avoid romance because he's afraid his intellect will be compromised by his emotions. This is a conflict a lot of Wilder characters have. And he falls in love with a German spy and fails in his mission. And it's a tragic love story, but nobody went to see this film because they weren't interested in that kind of film. And then he makes Avanti, which was seen as old-fashioned. And, he went, his romanticism came out of the closet, in a sense, in the 70s, and the true romantic. Diamond said Wilder was, he said he was from the Viennese tradition of Schnitzler, for example, who wrote Laurent, the Max Ophuls made into a great film. And Eyes Wide Shut, the Kubrick film, is based on a dream novel by Schnitzler. And he's a guy who was a disappointed romantic, as Diamond said, and they both dealt with very frankly and very profoundly with sexuality and the self-destructive impulses in human beings and the terrible conflicts sometimes in relationships. And that was the tradition that Wilder came out of, was that Viennese tradition of the 1920s and Schnitzler. Diamond endorsed Andrew Sarris's phrase about Wilder. He said he was like curdled cream that had gone sour, So Wilder was, for example, The Front Page, which I've always liked that film. It is
Me too. I just saw it for the first time. I hadn't seen it before.
Oh, what did you think?
And I liked it a lot. And same with Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. I also liked a lot. And he was also dealing with the sort of ambiguities of their sexuality, whether, perhaps they're gay or bisexual or heterosexual. It's much more direct than, say, something like Some Like It Hot, but he did it in such a brilliant way in Some Like It Hot, and I appreciated your insights because I never really gave it much thought that Lemon may be gay, particularly like you said, he's really comfortable in women's shoes, and then he's so happy that he's going to marry a millionaire. And I was like, yeah, I mean, you wouldn't just be happy about marrying a millionaire if you're straight and it's a man.
Yeah.
And in some ways, and you look at something like, and I love Tootsie with Dustin Hoffman, and they borrowed heavily from Some Like It Hot. It's the same, sort of essence, where it's a man becoming a better man as a result of women, walking around in women's shoes. And he's also sort of manipulative of women, the Dustin Hoffman character. And then from being a woman, he becomes better. But he's purely heterosexual from the beginning to the end. You'd never doubt that he may be gay, even though he's really good at playing a woman. And whereas Some Like It Hot, he's much more daring. And even that ending, it really makes me think, the guy is not bothered when he finds out that Lemon is a guy. And you might just think that's one might just think that's funny, like I always did. But if you think about it, it is playing with that gender fluidity of like, oh, I love you whether you're a man. It doesn't matter your gender. And I thought, wow, Jesus.
Can you imagine me back in 1959, 12-year-old Catholic kid seeing this film and like, whoa, what's going on here?
Exactly. Yeah.
You don't really know what's going to happen with those two guys after the film is over. But Lemon's character really enjoys being a girl, and he's one of the wonderful moments is they work out their names are Joe is supposed to be Josephine, and but when they introduce themselves at the train to the woman who's in charge of the girls' band, Jack Lemmon blurts out, "I'm Daphne." Right. It's like, where did this come from? It came from his inner woman somewhere, Daphne, And it's the first
really interesting insight.
Something is going on in his subconscious that he's Daphne, but he's has a ball being a woman. He just finds it hilarious. But he's also has the hots for Marilyn Monroe, as does Tony Curtis, but in different ways. Jack Lemmon is always kind of a klutz, and it's hilarious. But whereas Curtis is manipulating Monroe to try to seduce her, he's very funny and puts on this Cary Grant routine. And Wilder has so many movie jokes in his films too. I always enjoyed the movie jokes and allusions but it's a very daring film, and it goes farther than as you say, Tootsie's a good film, but it's not as unconventional as Some Like It Hot. Which, doesn't make a big deal, doesn't have long speeches about it. Tootsie's a little more pretentious. I mean, it kind of has people talking about these issues and stuff. Whereas Some Like It Hot just kind of barrels along, and lets you experience it. One of the things that is great about Some Like It Hot, and it's based on two movies, and I had to go all the way to Berlin to see Fanfares of Love, a German film that it's a remake of. They kind of didn't tell the public much about how it's a remake, although you can see in the writing credits that it's based
I didn't know that. When you wrote that, I was surprised.
Yeah, no, that film is not available in America. And that in turn was a French film in the 30s. And I finally saw that. That took a long time for me to see that. But what Wilder felt was missing from those stories, and actually Some Like It Hot is a lot more like Fanfares of Love than he admitted. He claimed that it was a terrible film and he didn't take much from it, but actually, it's not that terrible, and he took a lot from it. But the motivation for the two guys dressing as women in Fanfares of Love is that they're out of work and they're willing to do anything, and it shows a bunch of scenes where there's one scene where they're in blackface, which Wilder said you certainly couldn't do that today, and they go into a gypsy band and they're dressed like gypsies. But in Some Like It Hot, he starts with the St. Valentine's Day massacre. So the guys are witnesses to this gangland shooting, and they're literally on the run for their lives, and they have to, the only escape is to get in this girl's band, and then it's one of the greatest screenplays ever written, perfect screenplay. And it winds up with the gangsters finding them down in Florida. But Wilder said you need a life or death motivation. I think he said I think he said Diamond was the one who said that. They always gave each other credit for, they didn't try to hog credit, but they agreed that you need a life or death motivation for these guys to dress up as women so that they can't just pull off their wig and say, I'm a guy,
Right. Exactly.
That's one reason it works. But David O. Selznick, for example, the producer friend of Wilder's, conventional kind of guy, said, "Oh, you can't start a movie with the murders and shootings and stuff. This is a comedy. I mean, how's this going to work?" And when they had the first preview, it was in Pacific Palisades, which is kind of an upscale neighborhood, and people weren't laughing except for Steve Allen was in the audience, and he had a great laugh. If you remember, Steve Allen had a wonderful laugh, and Wilder said I was always grateful to him for laughing all the way through the movie. But a lot of mothers were running up the aisles with their kids when they saw the men dressed as women. So the executives,
that unfortunately still happens today. I've seen it myself in different pantomimes and stuff like that.
Yeah, when Joe Dante made Gremlins, people were running out of the theater with their kids and stuff, because it was outrageous. But
right.
The executives were panicking. They always think, let's cut 20 minutes out of the movie or some bullshit. And Wilder said, no, let's just get a different audience. So they previewed it again a couple days later in Westwood, which is a more sophisticated audience. That's where UCLA is. And he cut one little bit on the train, and that's it. And it played fantastically. And I think it had to do partly with some kind of advertisement they put outside the theater that indicated it's a comedy. You kind of have to tell people sometimes this film is a comedy.
Right. Make it a little more obvious.
Maybe the audience in Pacific Palisades, when they start with the gangsters shooting each other, they think, oh, this is a gangster movie.
I see.
Americans have a hard time, as Truffaut said, dealing with change of genres and
right.
change of mood in films. Like when he did Shoot the Piano Player, which is very funny, but has violence and romance and suicide and shootings and the audience. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times, who was a famous Square reviewer, said, Mr. Truffaut has flipped his lid with this film. But the audience got it. The audience, the more sophisticated audience in the 60s understood Shoot the Piano Player.
Yeah. It's also that homage that they were doing to the gangster films that they loved and in the new wave period. And that certainly pops. But again, the book is called Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge. Speaking of Some Like It Hot, you got to love that cover.
Yeah, that's a wonderful scene where Billy Wilder, the old tea dancer, is teaching Jack Lemmon how to dance the tango.
Yeah. That's such a great cover. When this is now out on paperback, but where's the best, if people want to get it, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, they can get it from Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Columbia University Press website. You can order the book on their website as well. It's out in paperback, and it's a big book about his whole life and career. It's not a biography, but a critical study, and
right.
And it's the, like I did with Lubitsch. There had been books on Lubitsch's American films and books on his German films, but there hadn't been much about his entire career. So with Wilder, I wanted to go through his career as a journalist, as a screenwriter in Europe, director in Europe, and then he comes to America and it goes through the whole oeuvre, and
right.
Had a lot of fun doing it.
Well, yeah, and it was a lot of fun to read, and I learned so much. I mean, it made me want to, because like I said, I'd seen most of his films, but it makes you want to go and see all the, everything he did and wrote. And I want to read now some of the biographies you mentioned on him as well. So it's fantastic. And of course, like you said, in early December, you have the George Cukor book.
Yeah, George Cukor's People, Acting for a Master Director from Columbia University Press, which is a study of again, a director who's respected, but I think misunderstood and underrated. People think he's not an auteur because, he didn't talk and foreground his themes like some directors did, but he was versatile, but he worked through his actors, and he was one of the greatest actors, directors. So I took the tack, which people haven't done before, of just analyzing all the performances that stand out in his work, about 60 different performances, and I go through all those, and that was a lot of fun to write that book as well. He's a wonderful director.
Great. Well, I look forward to reading that, and I'm sure we'll have you back. We'll have you back then to discuss that. And I mean, I want to read more of your books, so maybe we can figure out something else even sooner.
Yeah, anytime, Robert. You're always fun to talk to because you really dig into the subjects, that's kind of one reason I write these books, is I hope they make people like you did. You went and looked at Wilder films you hadn't seen before, like Hold Back the Dawn or Foreign Affair or whatever, and you discover these gems, and that's kind of I try to transfer my enthusiasm to the readers like you. So
great.
It's fun to talk to you.
Yeah, well, you certainly succeeded at that. So, we'll keep in touch, of course, and look forward to having you back again, Joseph.
Thank you, Robert. Anytime. See you later.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. Patreon is exclusive content that I create month in and month out. And as a subscriber, you are able to vote on polls and contribute to what I do on Patreon month in and month out. So head over to the link for full details. You can also leave a donation directly to my YouTube channel by pressing the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on the thanks link and you can leave a donation there if you choose to. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so. By pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movies logo, you will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left. In just a second, just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes. Also click the like button and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of this episode. Also, you can also share the episode. All of these things are what produce traction to my YouTube channel. So I appreciate you watching, and thank you again, and I will see you in the next episode.